Supply chains are complex, and securing your software supply chain is no exception. From the huge number of components and dependencies that you use from a wide variety of sources, to your developers adding their own code, to your applications being delivered to users around the world. How do you keep track of all this? At Anchore, we believe that managing and protecting your software supply chain starts with establishing trust. And that trust begins with understanding and managing your software bill of materials, or SBOM. SBOMs function as an ingredients label for software. And when you track and manage the ingredients, you can trust the components you use or bring into your development pipeline. It starts with verifying the provenance of open source code and validating supplier SBOMs, and keeping a repository of SBOMs to track the ingredients of your software over time. And maintaining trust as you build, with continuous automated security that uncovers vulnerabilities, malware, and leaked secrets, with compliance checks to root out any critical issues. Then, when you're ready to deliver your software, providing SBOMs and continuing to monitor for security risks after deployment, so your users can trust you and rest assured that the software you deliver was built securely every step of the way. To learn more about Anchore's software supply chain management solution, visit us at anchore.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Pope, Director of Developer Advocacy at Anchore. Let me just pop the slides up here, and welcome also to Neil Levine, who's our VP of Product at Anchore. Before we get started, there's a couple of bits of housekeeping to do, and I'll get through those pretty quickly, and then we can dive straight into the content. So first of all, everyone's muted except us. If you have any questions, just pop them in the little chat thing over on the right-hand side, and we'll address them as and when. And maybe we'll keep some for the end if we're running out of time. You'll get a follow-up email afterwards with a recording of this event. So don't worry if you join partway through, then you'll get a recording anyway. And we will pop up a few polls as we go through, just to learn a bit about you and understand your perspectives on what we're talking about today. So feel free to answer the polls as they appear on the right-hand side as well. And just a quick introduction to what we're going to talk about. Introduction to ourselves, I'll do that in just a moment. We're going to talk a little bit about, this slide looks out of date, I think. Do we have the right? Yes, we do. Okay. So,
old index.
Sorry, that's okay. These things happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's new since the last time we did one of these product updates. So there's three main things that we're going to talk about. The known exploited vulnerabilities. We'll talk a little bit about SIFT integration into Anchore Enterprise, and we'll talk a bit about a rather interesting new feature, the hosted feed service. Most of that's going to be down to Neil to talk about, but I'll be here to back him up and look out for your questions and comments. So, Neil, is there anything else we need to say before we dive in?
No, let's go straight to the content. Okay, thank you. So yes, this is actually part of a hopefully more regular series we'll do now, which is a quarterly update review about things going on. Probably not just on a product. We'll start to include stuff that's going on in the open source communities too, which Alan heads up. But for this session, we're going to focus mainly on Anchore Enterprise. We have a monthly release schedule, but we're going to try and do a sort of quarterly update to sort of give you the roll-up of all the things from the previous couple of months. So it's been quite an active period over the past quarter with Anchore. We're now up to version 5.10. And so these slides cover features, I think, from, yes, 5.8, 5.9, and 5.10. So let's just jump straight into the meat of the releases. All of the release notes for our products, if you're not tracking, are on docs.anchore.com. Our engineering team put a lot of effort into making sure we capture all the details there. So please read those for all of the specifics. But we're going to focus on sort of the three main updates that we've had over the past quarter. So the first one is the CISA Kev feed that we've now added to Anchore Enterprise. So CISA is the US department responsible for coordination effectively within the federal government around all things to do with critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. And they released a catalog or a database of vulnerabilities which they were seeing actively exploited in the federal government. And this catalog was designed to help federal agencies work out where to put their efforts, where to prioritize their vulnerability management efforts. As everybody knows, there are an awful lot of vulnerabilities in everything, everywhere. And so this was really to try and sort of help these federal agencies just be a bit more focused and pointed with their remediation efforts. So the catalog was published in both sort of human and machine format. I think it was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago now. And the records are fairly we say, not lightweight, but they're fairly concise. And there were 3 criteria which would determine if a KEV or known exploited vulnerability record would be created in their catalog. The first one is that there had to be an assigned CVE for that vulnerability. That is, they weren't trying to publish undisclosed or 0-day vulnerabilities. They were there to ensure that vulnerabilities which had already been published, in particular by NVD, got additional emphasis. So it had to have a CVE associated with it, CVE ID. The second area, and this is the most important one, is they had to be seeing active signs of exploitation. So as many folks know, a vulnerability, it doesn't really tell you whether it's actively being seen in the wild, or if it's, if there are current exploits which have been published and used. It's really just a CVE record, and particularly with NVD, is just, are we aware of there being a flaw in the software itself, not whether the situation was being exploited. So criteria number 2 is that they had to see it being exploited actively in a federal organization. So CISA, as that coordinating authority, would be given reports of exploits being identified and discovered, and again, the coordination role was to make sure that everybody else knew about it. And so that was the second criteria for this record to be created. The third and last one was that there had to be clear remediation guidance. So it wasn't sufficient to say it's got to there is a CVE, it's being actively exploited, panic. It had to be, there's a CVE, it's being actively exploited, here's what you do about it. So there is a filtering of actionable remediation options as part of the catalog entry. So here we have an example of an entry, and which covers, again, there's a CVE, there's an action. The additional field there, which is more specific to federal agencies, is the due date, which is designed to sort of imply a SLA or a turnaround time for remediating or fixing the issue in the software. So again, that was part of the executive order that came out from the US government a couple of years ago, and this was designed to sort of push through more of an enforced vulnerability management workflow for agencies and have them commit to update things. Okay, so that's what CISA, the KEV catalog, or KEV database is. And the way that we have implemented this is essentially as another feed service. So Anchore pulls down currently from many vulnerability feeds and other security sources, the common ones, NVD and GitHub, the various vendors. Essentially, this is now just another catalog or another database or another feed of records that we pull in. So it's not going to have anything that isn't already published, say, in NVD as a CVE, but again, it has that additional metadata of it's been exploited, and here's a due date. So that information gets pulled down through our feed service software, and you're going to see that's actually changed, the deployment of that in a little bit. But the feed service will pull that down and ensure that Anchore Enterprise has visibility to those additional records. Most importantly, you can then use this within Anchore Enterprise. So within the policy engine, there is within the vulnerabilities gate, which is the area where you can set what vulnerabilities and the metadata associated with them, what your rules are around that. You can now pick the vulnerability gate, select the Kev trigger, and then say if this CVE is on the Kev list, stop, warn, or go. So same as we do with all of the other policy options around CVSS data or severity and so on and so forth. So this is now available for all existing Anchore customers. And again, this is a great way to filter down the vulnerabilities that you need to sort of respond to most urgently, because it's giving you signs effectively of active exploitation as opposed to theoretical exploitation, which is one of probably the best ways to start to focus down your vulnerability priorities. Okay, so that's the CISA Kev list, and that was available, I believe it's in 5.8. Okay.
I linked to the blog post in the chat, so if people want to find out more information, they can find that out there.
Jolly good. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about part 2, which is expanded coverage of ecosystems with SIFT, which is the main headline, but I'm going to cover a little bit of how we use SIFT currently and what's changed. The main benefit, as you'll see, is being expanded ecosystem coverage, but there are some other ancillary benefits which we have now and will be continuing to benefit from over the coming couple of releases. So this is sort of a refresher on how Anchore uses SIFT. So SIFT is an open source project which we sponsor and have a number of developers working on, and it's an SBOM generation tool. And SIFT is used in Anchore Enterprise in 2 ways, and this has been true now for a good couple of years. The first way is, and this reflects 2 modes of scanning that we have with Anchore Enterprise. The first mode is what we call distributed mode, which is where the SBOM generation happens typically on a CI/CD node or a runner node associated with GitLab or GitHub or Jenkins, what have you. So in distributed mode, you're having the SBOM generation, which is quite time and process intensive, happening on as many different nodes as possible, right where the image is as it's being built through your CI job. So we have a command line tool called Anchore CTL, and SIFT is embedded inside Anchore CTL. So you run Anchore CTL, you're essentially running SIFT, but with additional functionality too. So it's not just a simple wrapper, it's actually got its own capabilities. So SIFT will generate the SBOM, but Anchore CTL will do other operations like looking for content inside files. It can look for secrets. It grabs a lot of additional metadata around the image that you're asking it to scan. So that's in distributed mode. Our second mode, which is sort of the more classic mode, is the centralized mode, where the image is being published to a registry, and then Anchore Enterprise pulls it down. It takes it down from the registry into your Anchore Enterprise deployment, and that's where the SBOM is being generated, essentially on the back end. And it's the same thing. Again, we use SIFT to generate the SBOM, but have additional scanners or additional drivers in effect to look for additional content. And importantly, and this is still the one variation between the distributed mode and the centralized mode, we can do malware scanning, which is, again, very process intensive, quite time consuming. That's only supported in the backend or centralized mode. So in both instances, SIFT is generating a large bulk of the content with the SBOM, equivalent to what you would run, or sorry, what you would see if you ran SIFT, just the open source vanilla version. But once that information has been generated, it then gets published into Anchore to do the rest of its operations, the vulnerability scan, the policy analysis, and so on and so forth. So these are two ways that SIFT is being used, and this has been true for, as I said, for a number of years. So what has changed is that before, where the functionality of SIFT included, say, coverage for a specific ecosystem, we would have to manually go and within the enterprise mode here, or the sort of centralized mode, expose that data out. If it was scanning for a new ecosystem, it would, like R, for example, a common language used in AI, ML, and statistics, we would have to formally go into Anchore CTL and Anchore Enterprise and say, hey, we've now got R as an additional ecosystem. Let's expose that out through the rest of the system. So it'd be a manual effort every time a new language was added upstream into SIFT. And so the main goal here is actually really to try and benefit from the speed of development in the SIFT community, which is pretty rapid, it's pretty fast, it's adding new features constantly. And we wanted to sort of create a way for that to flow in more naturally into the enterprise product, but the initial goal being certainly around enabling these ecosystems, which were already supported within SIFT, but we didn't formally support yet in enterprise. So here, for example, is a list of the SIFT ecosystem as of when the slide was created a week or two ago. So these are all of the languages, all of the ecosystems which we supported, which, prior to this update we've made, Enterprise only supported a subset of these. But with the new integration where we've now essentially re-implemented how SIFT is embedded in the tool, both for centralized and distributed mode, we now support every single ecosystem that's in SIFT. And most importantly, any new ecosystem will just flow in, and we don't have to do manual work or a deliberate piece of engineering to expose that ecosystem. It'll just appear dynamically. So in other words, bottom line is any ecosystem on SIFT is now also supported downstream on the Anchore Enterprise product as well. So the place where this is most immediately visible is within the SBOM view of Anchore Enterprise. So on the left-hand side, hopefully it's clear enough despite being in dark mode. Another new feature we launched but a few months ago. So on the left-hand side, where previously there was only a handful of ecosystems, the major ones like Python and Java and Ruby and so on, it's now got a long list, and that will dynamically populate whenever SIFT publishes a new version of the code with a new ecosystem. We then rebase on that version of SIFT during probably the same month. And then bang, we get the new ecosystem appearing on the left-hand side with all the associated metadata visible on the right-hand side of the SBOM view. And obviously this data is accessible through our API as well. So yes, main benefits, expanded ecosystem, but really it's about harnessing the speed and the activity of the SIFT ecosystem and making sure that flows down as quickly as possible into the enterprise product too. If you do want to see new ecosystems, please, as a customer, please let Anchore Enterprise know. We can then sponsor that work into the open source community and try and get it prioritized accordingly. But open source users are obviously happy to file their requests with GitHub, and that'll be done on a best effort basis there as well. The last thing that's on the roadmap for this particular area, now that we've re-implemented the SIFT integration, is there's an awful lot of metadata that SIFT captures, which again we had to manually decide, did we want to expose that metadata in Anchore Enterprise? The next phase of this work will be to ensure that every piece of metadata that is captured by the SIFT open source tool is also then exposed through the Anchore Enterprise tool. So lots of individual ecosystems have got very specific metadata. We want to make sure that that's going to flow through. So that's part of the next phase of work, which we'll be doing hopefully by the end of the year. Okay, let's move on. Oh,
I just wanted to mention,
yes.
you mentioned how SIFT is updated frequently, and I just took a look back over the releases on GitHub, and there's been 4 releases in the last month or so. And within those releases, obviously, there's the usual bug fixes and performance improvements and all that, but there's also community contributed ecosystems like OCaml, for example, that we might not have seen as a high priority target, but for one of our open source users, that was something that they needed as part of their development process. And someone else added support for detecting curl binaries, which is quite common because containers often contain very little but curl in order to bootstrap and get some other bits. So yeah, there's a whole load of stuff that gets landed in SIFT on a regular basis, every couple of weeks or so. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. So, there's definitely an advantage of, our commercial customers of Anchore will benefit from all of those ecosystem contributions going into the SIFT project. Those will now flow through directly. And so, again, real opportunity to benefit from an open source upstream project like SIFT. And the same applies to Gripe and Grant as well. Good. Okay, so let's move on to the last major update. And this is probably the biggest one. And So just the sifted re-implementation was done in 5.9. This is now 5.10. We're talking about the latest release, and probably the biggest change to the Anchor deployment sort of philosophy, as well as mode of operation here. So as you saw at the beginning of the slide when I was referencing the SysAkev information, the Anchor feed service, which is a piece of software which we ship as part of Anchore Enterprise, traditionally has been run by customers on the customer site, indicated on the below the dotted line on the screen here. So the feed service was a piece of software that customers would run, and it would then connect directly to the upstream sources of information. So it would reach out to NVD, GitHub, Red Hat, Ubuntu, and SysAkev, as we saw, as well as additional information that Anchor provided. We provide additional enriched information, some exclusion data to prevent false positives and so on. So all of that was, the feed service would go and connect to it, to these feed sources, to bring it down into a centralized database, normalize it, get it all ready for use by Anchore Enterprise. There was one variation to that, which is as part of our malware scanning, we do use the ClamAV database. The feed service didn't collect that. That was actually collected by the Anchore Enterprise backend itself. So one sort of incongruous sort of like data path there. But the principle being, you ran this software, it went out and got data from these various third parties. So the original design goals behind this was to give customers as much control over the individual feeds they wanted to consume, and also to sort of not have to worry about proxying issues through third parties and so on and so forth. You have to get that data directly. However, in practice, there have been a number of challenges with this architecture, and the main one, which comes up on a daily basis, is just network challenges. That if you're connecting to these third-party services, and there is a number of them now that we support, transient network issues are a sort of a fact of life on a day-to-day basis. And every time that the feed service was unable to connect to one of those third parties, it would flash up an error. Now, typically that error might disappear relatively quickly if it was a very small transient network issue. It might take a little bit longer if the problem was actually on the data feed itself. Interestingly, NVD, who's has had a number of issues over the past sort of year or so, they were suffering API issues. The API where they service the data would go down. Just they ran out of resources. It was unclear what was going on. But customers on the feed service would see this alert. NVD unreachable, and then you're sitting there having to diagnose what the problem is, only to discover it's not anything that you can affect. It's essentially with a third party itself. So those transient network issues were, an ongoing source of issues. There were other similar problems, which were with some of the feeds, not all of them, but some of the feeds, there could be arbitrary changes around schemas. We'd seen this with some of the open source projects where they wouldn't telegraph changes, it would just go ahead and make them, for example. And that schema change would happen overnight, resulting in a whole slew of new data coming in, or no data coming in, or major changes. So again, there was no protection from sort of some arbitrary changes made by a security team looking after a best effort vulnerability feed. Other issues were air gapping and firewall complexity. Running this feed service, it meant you had to open up a lot of holes in a firewall to connect to these third-party services. Maybe there were challenges registering for services like the GitHub vulnerability feed, where you need to sort of register for a token. Who's that token for? Because you can't necessarily do it as an individual. It has to be a company token. That presents some procurement challenges there. So lots of complexity around managing this, albeit at the benefit of giving you more direct control. But in general, I think the friction associated with this model was, creating more challenges than perhaps the benefits that were assumed might be there for customers. So this was the situation up until 5.9. So as of 5.10, the architecture has changed, and Anchore is in effect now running that feed service on behalf of our customers. as part of our new Anchore Data Service. And so we are going out and collecting that data and in effect insulating our customers from transient issues around networking, or just outages, which we can track and try and remediate with somebody's upstream sources directly. But also additionally, and hence the name, it's not just about the vulnerability feeds. This now allows us to get additional data such as the antivirus database or other sources of data we'd like to bring in, third-party bits of information to sort of help our customers get better insight into their components. So the Anchore Data Service is, we're running that feed service, we're collecting all this information. We're also adding in the additional enrichment and vulnerability research that we're doing internally, and bringing that all into essentially, a singular database, which then customers just pull down that ready-to-go database. It's pre-built, it's all zipped up and ready to go. So a side benefit of this is much faster to sort of boot up a new Anchore instance or to get access to that data. You don't have to wait for all of this very slow and time-consuming network activity. A secondary benefit is just cost. You don't have to run a feed service. It was, it took processor memory. It was an additional, cloud cost in effect. We're now bearing that. But the big one here is it's just one fewer components to manage in your environment with a lot less, operational and support overhead. So we're running the feed service. All customers as of 5.10 connect to that feed service to the data service, to bring down vulnerability feed information, antivirus information, and other sources of data to which, in future we can now just seamlessly put in without requiring any updates to the customer's environment.
I have to say, Neil, having deployed my own demo Anchore Enterprise instance, it's night and day from the previous having to wait for all the feeds to update on the first run. Is
yes,
yeah, it's so much
huge
better.
change. Yeah, it's a big design improvement. So look, it does come at a little bit of loss of sort of direct control. So again, one of the original ideas with customers running their own feed service was they could control how often they want to get updates. We're building this new data set every 6 hours roughly is how often we're doing it. So you connect, and if it's longer than 6 hours, you'll be pulling down a new set of data each time. But for most customers, we sampled across existing environments. 6 hours was fine. Data doesn't change that rapidly. And obviously, if there's a major incident and we see that there's something that really should be published immediately, we can accelerate that. But yes, so 6, much faster to boot, much faster to get those updates and ready in your system. A side benefit not even a side benefit, another major benefit is for lots of our customers who run in classified or air-gapped or IL6, as it's called in US federal government, is running how you connect to this in an air-gapped environment. So previously, customers would deploy the feed service in a DMZ and another feed service in effect on the air-gapped environment, and they would have to copy a database between the two. So again, it sort of put a lot of burden on running a piece of software with cost and operational complexity on the DMZ side. With the new service, it's incredibly simple. You literally use Anchore CTL with the one command shown there at the bottom of the screen to go grab this pre-built database. You don't, literally just a blob of data, and you use, put it on your USB stick or, your floppy disk, whatever it is you're using. Take it over to your air-gapped environment, run that command to push that file into the system, and that's it. I mean, it really couldn't be simpler here. So no need to run the feed service in a DMZ. No need to worry about sort of, managing data, databases in these two environments. Really, it's just like pull the database file, upload the database file, and that's it. So much simpler. Yeah. So this is now the default as of 5.10. We've worked very hard to ensure that customers should really see no change in the vulnerability results, assuming that you had all of these feeds enabled prior to 5.10. As long as you had all of the feeds, and we always recommend customers enable all the feeds to get the best coverage, it should be a one-for-one set of results that you see both with 5.9 and 5.10 for the same set of content. Given that we're now running this data service for our customers, there is a status page you can go to at status.anchoreenterprise.com, which will report on the availability of the service and indicate, the correct sourcing of all of the third-party information, whether it's the vulnerability feeds, the database feed, the Kev feed, which I mentioned before here. So you get a good granular view. We're also any changes to the data service in terms of new data sets or changes to the data set will be covered in the release notes, where the data service also has its own set of release notes on docs.anchor.com. So, those can be made independent of a release of Anchor Enterprise. Whenever we see you need to update it, we will, and you can track that there. And I believe the status page will also link to the release notes, so you can see the changes. And Alan is pointing out helpfully that you don't have to look at the web page. You can just connect it to an RSS feed, and there are some other options as well to get notifications through the web page. And that was it in terms of the current, quarter's worth of releases. We've got the coming quarter. It's a little less than a quarter. We're sort of halfway into the month. We have various holidays, but a quarter-ish. And some highlights of current things that we're working on within our major product categories. So I'll start in the middle two, which kind of reflect the current capabilities of the product, which is on the as part of the security set of capabilities, Anchor Secure. We're working on something similar to Kev in a way, which is EPSS, which is an additional set of information around vulnerabilities, which also looks at exploitability prediction. That's what the EP stands for. So it's an additional scoring system as an complement or alternative to CVSS, where it will look at the probability of a vulnerability being exploited given public activity. Have we seen exploits? Is it being widely discussed? Is there exploits being widely published? It will generate a score. Again, another way for you to filter down on your vulnerability scan results. On the Enforce side, which refers to all of our compliance management capabilities, we are updating our policy packs. So it's a lot more explicit information about the controls that failures might be or passes might be relating to, with recommendation remediation information that's provided by the policy controls. So look for some updated policy packs, principally to the NIST policy packs, 800 dash. This is I can never remember the specific numbers, but they're on our website. If you look at docs.anchor.com, all the various NIST controls are there. Going down to the bottom of the list, we are working on, in the spirit of the hosted feed service, more operational simplification, in particular for customers looking to deploy sort of a shrink-wrapped, ready-to-go, almost appliance-like experience on public clouds. We're working on a set of simplified operation sort of packaging for Anchor Enterprise 2. And then finally, on the SBOM side of things, we're taking our current SBOM capabilities, which is, it's foundational to the whole architecture of the product, and really elevating it to allow you to do more than, sort of cloud native and container scanning, but allow users to sort of bring any SBOM they want into the system. It could be handcrafted, artisan SBOMs you've built together in Notepad or Excel, or a fully generated SBOM used by SIFT, as long as it's in an SPDX or a Cyclone DX or SIFT format. As long as it meets the schema specifications, we don't care what the origin of that data is. We will bring it into the system and give you access to associated functionality. So sort of a new module, as it were, within a product. Okay, there's some highlights. Again, I'm a product manager, so no time commitments. These are sort of just candidates we're working on right now. So look to see those, hopefully, if not by the end of this year, certainly in the first half of next year. And with that, I will end the monologue and hand back to you, Alan.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate that, Neil. We have a couple of questions, and I'll read them out for you. So Sandeep asks, is it possible to create a logical grouping of SBOM hierarchy, like business unit, product, version in Anchore Enterprise SBOM management? It's a good question.
It is a good question, and the answer is yes, and we are going to improve it. So there are two facets or capabilities within a product at the moment which allow you to do that. So the first one is we are inherently a multi-tenant product. We call them accounts, which often causes some confusion, and we probably will rename that next year. But the system has different accounts, which you can essentially think of as different data silos. They're different ways of segmenting users, the content that you've generated for the with those users, and policies, reports. It's essentially a real multi-tenant system like that. So that could be used to separate out at the business unit level, which is very common, different business units, or it could be at a different project or product level. You have them in different things, but they're very siloed, they're very isolated. So it really is, a its own domain with no sharing between them. Within an account or within a single tenant, we do have a capability called application groups. And this is actually the feature that we're probably going to augment quite heavily as part of the Anchore SBOM row that you see on this slide here. So colloquially, I do refer to it as sort of application groups V2. And the goal there is that if you're defining, maybe you don't want to use a multi-tenant feature, you want to keep everything within a single account, it will allow you to sort of create essentially an arbitrary hierarchy or tree of content. So you can say, I want to map, SBOMs into different products. Those products then go into a complete service, and then that service is associated with a BU, and this BU is associated with an organization or something like that. So it will allow a much more detailed hierarchy rather than the very basic sort of multi-tenancy and single layer, which is what an application group is at present. It really is just, here's a collection of SBOMs and a version number, that's it. So yes, the plan for the SBOM capability is to give you that infinite tree in effect. But you can do something similar right now. It's just not as flexible as we know customers would like it to be.
Nice, that's super comprehensive. Thank you, Neil. We've got one more question I think we've got time for. We'll have to be quick though. Steve asks, I'd love to see a pivot table generated in the Anchore UI for vulnerability and SBOM visibility, because the flat CSV or JSON output is very time consuming to sort through. It'd be good to know if anyone's looking for similar kind of like easy to view UI.
Yes. So there are no plans to do that at the moment. We do have a, the UI is there to sort of give you the sort of first pass of the view of the information here. For customers doing more sophisticated analysis of the content, that's why we have our APIs and our export formats, as well as our reporting system to allow you to extract that information so you can sort of do that manipulation. We don't want to recreate the entirety of sort of Google spreadsheets or Excel within the UI with all that functionality. We want to give you visibility of the data, but manipulation of the data is something that we see there's a lot of tools outside of Anchore where, you should probably process it in that. Having said that, there are a number of improvements we do want to make to the UI to sort of show additional vulnerability metadata to allow you to do better sorting of it. So there is filtering and sorting and searching within the content, I think, is within the scope of the UI, but sort of sophisticated manipulation, we're going to continue to sort of recommend you do that in a third-party tool where possible.
Sweet. One final question, and that is another one from Sandeep. Does Anchore support VEX import and export? If yes, what formats are supported?
So no, not at present, but it is actually part of the roadmap candidates for next year, and this is definitely a very active conversation here. So no, there is some VEX support actually within the open source tools. I think Gripe has support for OpenVex. Alan may have more of the details
to some degree, yes.
Yes. So we do have some of the foundational bits already implemented in the open source. We do just need to bring that into the commercial product. So that is absolutely a candidate for the first half of next year. And in keeping with our support for Cyclone DX and SPDX and so on and so forth. And actually also we're relating to the previous question, that's one of the things that we do hope to expose within the UI is the doing the assessment workflows with Vex as the intended output, having that as a capability within the UI. So yes, definitely something to look for first half of next year.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neil. I think that's it for now. Thanks everyone for tuning in. There's a few links here. Don't forget, you'll also get a recording of this via email afterwards. If you're interested in the enterprise product, then you can get a free trial. There's a link here, and try it out yourself. If you're also interested in the open source side, Sift, Gripe, and Friends, then you can head on over to our GitHub repo, GitHub org rather, github.com/Anchore, and you'll find all the repositories over there. We also have a discourse where you can ask questions and interact with the developers and myself. There's also some case studies you could download from the website as well. I think that's everything. Thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and thanks for your questions and answering the polls. And we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Alan. Take care, everybody.